I remember the exact moment I realized my own daughter had betrayed me. It was a heavy, suffocating realization, like stepping into a darkened room and discovering the windows are boarded shut. My heart pounded so hard I thought the entire world must hear it. I was in my office, gazing at an empty wedding invitation envelope that had arrived just 2 days earlier. That envelope was supposed to contain my daughter's future, a tangible sign that I still had a place in her life, even after all these years of separation, custody battles, strained phone calls, and hurried holiday visits. Instead, I discovered I had no invitation at all. The slip of paper inside politely informed me that there would be no space for me at her wedding. It was baffling because I was convinced my daughter cherished me. I couldn't fathom her willingness to cast me aside. I had spent 2 decades juggling a busy schedule so I could support her in every possible way, emotionally, financially, and more importantly, personally. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, but I knew what I held in my hands. The simple words, "We regret that we cannot accommodate you," told me everything I needed to know. Let me back up for a moment. My life changed dramatically when I got divorced from my daughter's mother 20 years ago. Back then, we had a comfortable routine, or at least I convinced myself it was comfortable. We were still young, navigating the swirling demands of work, finances, and child rearing. I tried to be the best husband I could, and more important, I tried to be the best father. My daughter was just a toddler at the time, with bright eyes and an endearing way of looking at me like I was her entire world. But everything fell apart. Her mother and I simply weren't meant for each other. Arguments overshadowed calm moments, and in the end, we decided on a divorce that, in theory, should have protected my daughter from further trauma. I had no intention of abandoning her. The custody agreement allowed me a few days each week, or in some stretches, we'd swap so that if her mother was traveling with a boyfriend, I would have my daughter for longer periods. It worked out on paper, less so in practice. To give a little context, I own a successful company. Let that company be called Novastart, a name I chose because I believed it symbolized new beginnings, not just in business but in my personal life. I had always been passionate about launching innovative ideas, building them from the ground up, and watching them thrive. I traveled frequently for work, negotiated deals, and oversaw major projects. But no matter how hectic my schedule got, I always made time to spend with my daughter. Sometimes that meant flying back on red-eye flights just so I could pick her up from school in the afternoon. Other times, it meant letting her sit in on non-confidential online meetings just so she could see what I actually did. I wanted her to be part of my life. Meanwhile, her mother, let me call her Mara, didn't share that same work ethic. She used to pick up short-term jobs here and there, but she never stayed employed for more than a few years total. She found the job environment stressful, or so she would say. She also found it easy to move in and out of relationships, often with men who promised her something new, something glamorous, but rarely delivered. Over the years, my daughter, let me call her Clara, ended up with a rotating cast of stepfathers. I lost track of the exact number after the third, though I remember them by face. One was a flashy show-off, another was a well-spoken type who bragged about his travels, and the most recent one, the man Clara eventually named as her true father figure, was a quiet, calculating individual who rarely looked me in the eye. Because Clara lived with her mother, I always made sure they were provided for. I didn't see it as an obligation, although plenty of divorced men gripe about supporting an ex-wife. I believed that if Mara was raising our daughter, then I had to do my part. After all, our child needed a stable home. I had no problem giving a share of my income toward rent, groceries, and anything my daughter might need. In fact, I often gave that money directly to Clara once she was old enough to handle it. I trusted her with it, more than I trusted Mara, though I always kept Mara informed of the amounts so there would be no misunderstandings. Clara was a bright kid, and at a surprisingly young age, she showed an aptitude for saving and using that money wisely. As Clara got older, I watched as the mother-daughter bond seemed to grow complicated. Sometimes, Clara would be sweet and loving toward me, and then, After a vacation with Mara, she would become distant. I couldn't figure it out at first, but I started to suspect my ex-wife might have been feeding her twisted stories, portraying me as stingy or overly focused on my company. Once, Clara confided that her mother said I was giving them just enough money to survive, but not enough to thrive. In reality, I had provided far more than that. I sensed that Mara resented my success, especially since she chose not to work long term. Perhaps she wanted more of my finances under her direct control. Still, Clara and I found ways to connect. I remember when she was 12 and took an interest in music. I knew a couple of people, business partners whose children studied at prestigious schools, and I arranged an extracurricular summer program for her. She stayed with me for almost 3 weeks straight while her mother was off on a cruise with a new boyfriend. We spent those weeks in the evenings, listening to her practice, sometimes missing a note but determined to improve. I watched the concentration on her face as she repeated a tricky section of a song. Those days reminded me that while my marriage might have failed, my relationship with my daughter did not have to. Over the years, though, I saw that Clara absorbed some habits from her mother. She became occasionally dismissive of me, especially when a new stepfather arrived on the scene. She'd mention how this new man was the best father figure, how he understood her better, how he was truly there for her in ways I apparently wasn't. It hurt, but I persisted. I tried to remind Clara that I was consistent in my role, that I had always shown up for her recitals, birthdays, and even random midweek calls when she felt stressed about school. Sometimes she recognized my efforts. Other times, she gave me a flat stare, as though she was echoing her mother's sentiments. Then she turned 20. By that point, Clara had cycled through multiple stepfathers, each overshadowing me in her mind. I recall one especially frustrating incident. She told me I was old-fashioned compared to her new stepfather, who had introduced her to advanced phone technology and some digital art tools. I chuckled to myself because, ironically, my company was at the forefront of technological innovations, far more sophisticated than those new gizmos. But I said nothing, not wanting to become petty or resentful. Time went on. One day, out of nowhere, I received a call from Clara announcing her engagement to a man I'd met only once in passing. She was overjoyed, talking about how this fiancé was the love of her life and how she looked forward to building a future with him. I was genuinely happy for her. I didn't sense any hidden motives then. I told her I couldn't wait to walk her down the aisle if that was her wish. She paused and said something about how she was still figuring out all the details, but she did want me there. My heart soared. It felt like, finally, father and daughter would have the public moment we never truly experienced. And I wanted to give her a gift that would secure her future, a share of Novastart. It was a monumental gesture, but she was my only child, and I dreamed of her involvement in the company should she ever choose that path. I had it all planned out. The official certificate documents, detailing a portion of stock ownership, sat in my desk drawer, hidden under some contract folders. She had no idea I was doing this, and I anticipated the look of surprise and gratitude on her face when I would hand it to her on her wedding day. I had even prepared a little speech about how proud I was and how I believed in her future. Whether she decided to actively work at Novastart or simply benefit from its growth, the choice would be hers. And then the unthinkable happened. One afternoon, just weeks before the wedding, I was informed that the invitation I had received was being withdrawn. Clara herself told me on the phone. She said, "There's no space for you, Dad. The venue is small and there's a certain budget, so we had to narrow down the guest list." I asked who precisely replaced me on that list. She dodged the question. I found out a couple days later from a mutual acquaintance that her new stepfather, let me call him Victor, insisted on attending, and she wanted him to have some official part in the wedding ceremony. He was, in her words, the one she truly considered a father. That statement felt like a dagger in my heart, but I tried to remain calm. Though it pained me, I accepted her decision with as much dignity as I could muster. I told myself that forcing my way into her wedding would only make matters worse. If she felt so strongly about not having me there, maybe it was best I stayed out of it, but part of me was devastated. I had always envisioned walking her down the aisle, giving her a reassuring smile before letting her new spouse take her hand. The fact that she replaced me with a man who had entered her life a mere 5 years ago, while I had been there since her first breath, felt like a betrayal more profound than any I had known. In the midst of all this, her mother Mara was, as usual, elusive. She sent me a message once, something along the lines of, "It's Clara's decision. You should respect that." I wasn't surprised by her stance. I remembered all the times Mara belittled my contributions when Clara was younger, or how she manipulated situations to favor whichever partner she was seeing at the time. This was just a continuation of the same pattern. The wedding day drew nearer, and I retreated from the entire affair. I pushed my sorrow into my business dealings, forging new partnerships and traveling internationally for negotiations. While abroad, I caught a rumor that made me grin grimly. Apparently, Clara had discovered, through a friend of hers, who was the child of one of my longtime business partners, that I'd planned a surprise wedding gift. She must have found out the size and significance of the share I was going to give her. That rumor apparently reached her ears just 2 days before the ceremony. Suddenly, I received a frantic call from Clara. She was crying, apologizing for the misunderstanding, claiming she didn't realize I had been seriously preparing for her wedding. She told me, "I always wanted you to come, Dad," as if the rescinded invitation had never happened or was some accidental slip. She promised me that if I came to her wedding, she would make sure there was a seat for me in the front row. She even offered for me to stand beside Victor during the ceremony. My stomach turned at that suggestion. Some might have refused to show up at that point, refusing to be an afterthought, but I'll admit, I was still gullible enough to cling to the hope that maybe my daughter had seen the light. Maybe the rumor about the gift had only reminded her how much I loved her, and that the father-daughter bond was more important than the petty manipulations of her stepfather. So I said, "Yes, Clara, I'll be there." I arrived on the wedding day wearing a tailored suit. I had double-checked the original gift documents that morning, but made a last-minute decision. I left them in the hotel safe. I carried nothing but a small envelope with a simple card wishing her and her new spouse happiness. If her invitation was genuine, if her tears on the phone had been genuine, she'd be happy just to see me there, supporting her. If not, well, I wouldn't be handing out anything that day. At first, Clara rushed to greet me with a bright smile. She hugged me, albeit with a slight stiffness, then whispered, "Did you bring the certificate?" That was the first thing she said after, "Hello, Dad," and even that greeting was overshadowed by her anxious question. I looked at her for a moment, searching her face for signs of sincerity or regret. I only saw impatience. I asked, "What certificate?" Her eyes widened. She couldn't believe I'd play ignorant. "Dad," she insisted, "the document for the company shares. You know what I'm talking about." She was nearly trembling with anticipation. In that moment, I felt a cold resolve wash over me. The heartbreak I'd been suppressing rose to the surface, and behind that heartbreak was anger. But I was oddly calm. I told her, "I don't recall any such document. Perhaps you're mistaken." I watched her expression slowly crumble. She had never expected me to say that. She expected me to come running with the final piece to her financial puzzle, to pave the way for her new life with an enormous safety net. Instead, I offered a kind but firm smile and gently tucked the envelope with the simple wedding card into her hand. I said nothing else about the gift. I told her I hoped the ceremony would go smoothly, but I could see her eyes fill with tears. Tears that came less from heartbreak and more from disbelief that I was withholding what she believed was rightfully hers. She tried to argue, whimpering half-coherent pleas, trying to remind me how she had grown up with me always around, how I had taken her on vacations, how we had those father-daughter days. It sounded almost rehearsed. Where was that warmth when she had rescinded my invitation the first time? I stood my ground, quietly repeating that I had no such certificate. As she walked away, I saw her biting her lip, furious. I won't deny that my heart pounded painfully the rest of the day. I stood off to the side as the ceremony went on. Victor, that stepfather of 5 years, escorted her part of the way down the aisle. I saw the fiancé's face when he heard the commotion about some missing certificate, though he seemed clueless, and I realized that was probably for the best. Clara hadn't told her future spouse about the gift, or maybe she had, and they both assumed I'd just cough it up. The entire wedding felt surreal to me. At the reception, I sat at a table in the back, away from the family, occasionally receiving curious glances from guests who were trying to figure out who I was. I recognized some old friends of Clara's from her teenage years, children of my own business partners. Some gave me sympathetic looks, aware that I had been deliberately sidelined. I nodded politely, not wanting to draw attention. I saw Mara, my ex-wife, drifting around the crowd. She looked at me once with a half-smirk, as though she finally had the upper hand. I wondered if she knew about the last-minute fiasco with the certificate. If she didn't then, she'd soon hear it from Clara. I tried to stay until the toasts were done, but the tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't help feeling out of place. Clara was miserable, or at least furious, but she kept a plastic smile on her face for the guests. Victor mingled with everyone, playing the role of the supportive father. He shot me a glance here or there, but never approached. I overheard from a conversation that he'd bragged about paying for certain wedding costs, though I knew for a fact Clara had used money I'd given her over the years, money I intended for her college and future expenses. That was how she covered some of the wedding bills. If Victor contributed anything, it was a fraction of what he claimed. By the time I decided to leave, the sky outside was stained with the last colors of sunset. I caught one last glimpse of Clara, who tried to race after me. She grabbed my arm and demanded, "Why are you doing this?" Her voice cracked. For a moment, I felt my heart soften, recalling the days when she was just a curious little girl, clinging to my leg in public, trusting me to guide her through life. Then I remembered her betrayal, how she had disinvited me in favor of a more convenient father figure, and how she only changed her mind upon discovering my wedding gift. Any guilt that blossomed in me quickly withered. "Because I don't forgive betrayals," I said quietly. "I love you, but you made your choice." Then, gently removing her hand from my arm, I stepped out of the venue. I heard her sobbing behind me, but I kept walking. I believe everyone who does evil, who manipulates, who discards people as if they're worthless, will eventually reap consequences. I had no doubt that both she and her mother would regret how they treated me. My revenge, if you want to call it that, was simply withholding what they thought they could exploit me for. I wasn't going to fund this deception. I wasn't going to reward betrayal. In the days that followed, I braced myself for the fallout. Indeed, I received lengthy messages from Clara, repeating lines that might have come straight from her mother. She accused me of being petty, of ruining the wedding, of pretending to be a devoted father. But her words no longer held power over me. The moment she disinvited me, I saw clearly where her priorities lay. I left her messages unanswered for a time, letting her process the fact that I was not going to be manipulated. Meanwhile, Mara attempted to call me as well, claiming she only encouraged Clara to listen to her heart. The subtext was obvious. She thought Clara would be better off forging a strong relationship with a present father, meaning whichever man Mara had decided was fatherly enough, while I became nothing more than a bank account. I told Mara that I had heard enough of her nonsense. After all, she'd spent years job hopping, living off the money I provided under the pretense of caring for our daughter's well-being, and mocking me all the while. I reminded her that my financial obligations ended once Clara reached adulthood, and that any further help was purely at my discretion. In short, there would be no more money for them to siphon. I wouldn't stop helping Clara if she was in true need, but I would help her directly, not funnel my support through a mother who had systematically tried to edge me out of Clara's life. To an extent, I suspect Mara and Victor used Clara as a pawn in their scheme to gain access to my resources. I later learned that Victor had fallen on hard financial times prior to meeting Mara. They likely hoped that securing fatherly status at Clara's wedding would open up a flow of funds, especially after hearing about my rumored wedding gift. People talk, and in business circles, certain big gestures are not uncommon. But they forgot one thing. I never reward a betrayal. If Clara had simply told me from the start that she preferred Victor by her side because she was grateful to him, I might have still given her the share of the company. I don't require total, unwavering devotion, only honesty. But the way she disinvited me without a second thought, only to reinvite me when money was at stake, showed me the real nature of her motivations. I still sometimes wonder if perhaps I was too harsh. I've asked myself late at night, lying awake, if I should have let my anger subside and tried to rebuild our connection. But each time, I recall the emptiness I felt reading that wedding note, the blatant disregard for my place in her life. She knew exactly how much I cared, how I had always found time for her, and she cast me aside anyway. I've made peace with my decision never to forgive betrayals of that magnitude. I will always love her. How could I not love my own child? But love does not always override the damage inflicted by disloyalty. Word eventually spread among my circle of business partners that I'd refused to finalize the gift. A few sympathized, saying they understood how manipulative certain family members can become. Some even admitted to experiencing similar heartbreak when their children sided with an ex-spouse for mercenary reasons. Others politely suggested that I might reconsider, but in the end, the choice was mine. For a while, I turned my focus to Nova Start. I had expansions to oversee, new product lines to refine, and philanthropic projects to manage. I channeled my hurt into productivity. I thrived in my professional realm, closing deals and forging strategic alliances that bolstered Nova Start's reputation. Ironically, the share I had intended to give Clara soared in value due to a lucrative contract I signed just a month after her wedding. She could have been part of something big and fulfilling, something that would have provided for her future children. But she forfeited that chance the day she decided that my presence wasn't important unless it came with a financial windfall. One might ask if I was truly punishing her or if I was protecting myself. To me, it was a bit of both. She had wounded me deeply. I retaliated by withholding what I felt she no longer deserved. I know some might see it as petty, but to me, it was about principle. If she learned anything, perhaps it was that a father is not just an ATM or a stepping stone for personal gain. A father's love should not be taken for granted. It wasn't only Clara who faced consequences. Mara, who often liked to flaunt her connection to me as a source of money or prestige, found herself cut off. Over the years, I had sometimes paid for her medical bills, her travel, and any other odds and ends she tried to attribute to Clara's needs. After the wedding debacle, I ended that practice. I told her explicitly she should stand on her own feet or rely on the men she chose to bring into Clara's life. That meant her lavish trips to tropical destinations and ostentatious get-togethers with friends would no longer be subsidized by me. From what I heard later, she had to cancel a couple of planned vacations. And once Victor realized he couldn't squeeze anything out of me, despite being hailed as Clara's true father, he apparently lost interest in Mara as well. Rumor has it that their relationship broke apart not too long after. I consider that a piece of cosmic justice. No one who tries to exploit another person's generosity is likely to find lasting contentment. As for Clara, I saw her only once more in person after the wedding fiasco. She visited my office unannounced about a year later. She said she wanted to talk. A wave of emotions hit me: love, anger, regret, sadness, hope. But when she sat down, her tone was cautious, as though she was stepping on thin ice. She told me she was going through difficulties with her new spouse, that they were short on funds, that the wedding had left them with bills, and that she was considering advanced schooling. I listened calmly. She danced around the real question for a while, but eventually came to the point. She hoped I might reconsider the share in Novastart, or at least give her some financial assistance. I asked her point blank, Do you regret inviting Victor to walk you down the aisle instead of me? She looked away, fidgeting. Then she said, he wasn't what I thought he was. It was the closest she came to admitting any remorse. Yet she never really apologized for her betrayal. Instead, she tried to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming that her mother and stepfather had pressured her. She was an adult at the time of the wedding, fully capable of making her own decisions. Hearing her shift blame only hardened my heart. We talked for a while longer, and I explained my position clearly. I supported you because I loved you. I would have continued supporting you even after you were grown if you had respected me as a father, not just a wallet. When you cast me aside for your wedding, you made it clear how little you valued me until you found out about the gift. That told me everything I needed to know. She opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it. She must have known there was no point in arguing. Before she left, I told her I didn't hate her. I told her I still loved her, but I would not forgive betrayal. I gave you everything I could, from time and money to the space in my heart. You threw that away, so now you have to stand on your own 2 feet. I wish you well in that. She said nothing as she walked out, shoulders slumped, a hollow look in her eyes. In the months that followed, I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. Clara apparently moved to another part of the country with her spouse, trying to start fresh. I have no idea whether they made it work or if, like many other relationships in her mother's pattern, it fell apart, I admit. Sometimes I wonder how she's doing, if she's safe, or if she's struggling. The parental instinct is hard to silence, but I push those thoughts away. After all, her final words to me at the wedding were essentially demands for something she thought she was owed. I can't pretend she didn't wound me. Maybe, someday, if she truly understands the meaning of regret and seeks genuine reconciliation, I might have a different conversation with her, but as of now, I see no sign of that happening. When I reflect on it all, I realize how quickly a relationship can be twisted when betrayal sets in. A father who devotes years to raising his child can be dismissed in favor of a newcomer. A child who once seemed sweet and appreciative can become cruel and calculating under the wrong influences. And yet, the fatherly love I once held doesn't vanish overnight. It transforms into something guarded, cautious, and a bit sorrowful. I share this story not to paint myself as a saint or to claim that I was the perfect father. I had my flaws, and I devoted a lot of time to building Novastart. Perhaps I should have confronted the negative whispers from Mara and her boyfriends more firmly at an earlier stage. Maybe I could have protected Clara from their manipulative attitudes, but I did what I could with the knowledge I had at the time. In the end, I'm satisfied that I did not surrender to cynicism or adopt the mindset of just pay child support and ignore the rest. I tried to be present, supportive, and loving. The tragedy is that this love was used as a bargaining chip, to be discarded and reclaimed whenever money was on the line. Still, I have a principle. If someone betrays me, they must answer for it. I don't believe in letting evil deeds or manipulative actions go unaddressed. Everyone who has crossed that line in my life has eventually faced the fallout, including Mara and Victor. Did I actively engineer their suffering? Not exactly. It was more a matter of stepping back and allowing the natural consequences to unfold. When a person builds a life on greed and deception, that life eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies. The morning after the wedding, I opened my desk drawer, took out the official share transfer documents that had been intended for Clara, and shredded them. I remember a profound sense of finality as the paper crumpled and tore. It wasn't just a stack of documents, it was a dream, a hope that one day, my daughter and I might share something bigger than ourselves. She had tossed that hope aside, and now I was literally cutting it into pieces. I sat there for a moment, breathing, letting the wave of sadness roll through me. Then I stood up, walked to my office window, and looked out at the city skyline. Life would go on. Today, I run Novastart as successfully as ever, forging ahead with new expansions and philanthropic endeavors. I focus on helping communities and families who lack resources, a different kind of parental support that sees me as a benefactor, not a scapegoat. Sometimes I see a father playing with his child in the park, and I recall the simpler days when Clara was so little she could fit in my arms. My heart aches, but it reminds me that I am capable of love, that what happened wasn't my failure alone. I've learned that betrayal is often a twisted reflection of the betrayer's own fears and desires. Clara, shaped by Mara's short sightedness and the false promises of multiple stepfathers, might have believed she needed to follow in that pattern to secure her future. She was wrong, and now she'll reap the consequences. Perhaps one day she'll rectify her outlook on life, but until then, I stand by my resolve. I love her, but I will not forgive her betrayal. People ask, "Don't you want to fix things?" And I answer honestly, if she truly shows remorse, if she comes without demands, if she acknowledges that I was and am her father in more than just blood, then maybe we can build new bridges. But that path starts with genuine regret. It doesn't start with phone calls about money or frantic wedding invitations sent only after hearing about a lavish gift. When I imagine the future, I see different possibilities. Maybe Clara remains distant, consumed by her own pride, or influenced by another manipulative voice. Maybe she matures, has children of her own, and realizes the pain of a child's rejection firsthand. Life can be strangely poetic in the way it teaches us lessons through our experiences as parents. But I won't dwell on that. My life moves forward, enriched by work, friendships, and the knowledge that I stayed true to myself. I didn't stoop to personal attacks or spread lies. I simply withheld what she had never appreciated, a gift that was mine to give. Some might call it cruel revenge, but I see it as balanced justice. After all, if Clara had approached me with genuine kindness and honesty, I would have given her the world. Her mother's meddling, her stepfather's opportunistic influence, and her own misguided priorities turned what could have been a beautiful day of father-daughter celebration into the final wedge that drove us apart. I look back at everything that led to that wedding day, the short stints Mara worked, the multiple stepfathers, the times Clara stayed with me for 2 or 3 weeks while her mother jetted off somewhere else, the gifts I showered upon Clara when she was young. I recall the phone calls I took in the middle of the night to soothe her worries, the times I rescheduled business trips to attend her recitals, the big dreams I had for us as a father-daughter duo conquering life with mutual support. It's all real, all part of our shared history, yet it culminated in a betrayal that I can't overlook. So this is where I stand today, recounting a story of love, betrayal, and the unfortunate truth that even family bonds are not immune to manipulation. If someone betrays me, I can love them but refuse to forgive them. And I can trust that eventually their choices will circle back in some way. I have no illusions about being perfect, but I do know I gave my daughter every chance to see me as more than just an ATM. She made her choice and I responded accordingly. In the end, that's all there is, a father who tried his best, a daughter who took a different path, a mother who thrived on convenience, and stepfathers who came and went without any real attachment. Each antagonist met with some consequence or another. Mara lost her easy funding and eventually her latest partner, Victor, was left with no leverage and apparently moved on. And Clara, my dear daughter, found out the hard way that my generosity was not endless, that it hinged on respect and sincerity. And that is the story, from my perspective, of how my daughter did not invite me to her wedding, then tried to yank me back when she realized how seriously I had prepared for it, and finally discovered I'm not one to reward betrayal.